Okay. So I'd like to start off with just a little bit of a quick quiz. So if you can, grab a scrap piece of paper or something near you and just kind of note down what your answers are to the following short questions, and then we'll kind of take a look at this at the end of the session. So here's the first question. Please indicate for the following statement the extent to which you A, strongly agree or simply agree, B, neutral, or C, strongly disagree or disagree. And here's the statement. Part of why I enjoy my job in the food service industry is because I enjoy certain moments of pleasure that this job brings me. Personally. Question number 2. Please indicate for the following statement the extent to which you A, agree, B, neutral, or C, disagree. I enjoy experiencing cultural differences that are new to me. So make sure you're just taking a note of whether you are selecting A, B, or C for these answers. And lastly, you're visiting another country and you're served a bowl of soup with a live fish swimming around in it. How would you feel? A, this is new to me. How interesting. B, a little bit of a question mark. C, I will eat it for no less than $1 million. Not saying that you have to eat the fish, of course, but the soup that you're eating has a live fish in it. Okay, so I'm going to leave you hanging until the end of the session today to kind of just talk about these questions and why I have brought them to your attention. But I want to take a minute to introduce, like I said, my company and maybe even give you a chance to introduce yourselves a little bit. So who is 7C Lingo? We're a cross-cultural communications agency here in Lansing, Michigan. And we formed in 2007 to respond to a need in our community to address the professional challenges that were posed by, originally the need was language-based, and then we kind of expanded to move into just the entire cross-cultural experience, and then we also provide travel management services that kind of tie everything together and allow us to work holistically with our clients to meet their global needs. So like I said, we work with mostly professionals, but this can range anywhere in the professional continuum from developing professionals, which are students, to very experienced and highly technical professionals in various fields. And with that, we have developed a mission which is to revolutionize the field of cross-cultural communications and the application that culture can have on you and your life. If anybody else would like to just kind of quickly say your name and you know, where you work and what your motivations were for attending this webinar today, that would be excellent. Feel free to chat as well if that works best for you. I'll give you a minute. Yeah. Okay, so I hear some typing, but let's go ahead and just move on so that we can make sure that, I know it's early. Oh, we have a little bit, we have an introduction here. Just a quick question, how long? We're probably going to plan on about an hour, and I'll try to leave some time for question and answer at the end. So if you have a commitment at 10, you should be perfectly fine. Thank you, Marissa. Okay. So I'd like to just take a moment to introduce the concepts that are going to lay the foundation for our discussion today. So bear with me for a moment as I do due diligence to what will be as I said, the foundation, which is the word culture. And the reason that I feel the need to do this is because, as most of us know, can be an extremely vague term that is used very differently in very different contexts by different people. So I just want to take a moment to define it in the way that will work for us here today. Last year, Merriam-Webster's dictionary stated that culture was the most popular word of the year in 2014. And this is pretty significant, just to kind of as a demonstration of how things are changing in our world today, and what the most important word is in a world is a pretty good indicator of what context we're serving in. So the definition that we like to use is the system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that the members of society use to interact with their world and with one another. So although we tend to focus more on global cultures that are embodied by our population, even right here in Michigan, culture is actually much more than this. And it's what allows people to really be able to organize their world without having to reinvent the wheel all the time. So it's what allows you to walk into a restaurant, or one of your customers to walk into a restaurant, and not really have to stop or hesitate or look around to kind of get a feel for what's going on. They might not even have to break stride before they realize kind of where to go, where to sit, how to operate. But if they were to walk into the same context or the same type of restaurant in a foreign environment, maybe they walk in and they see a sign right by the door, but they can't read it because it's in a language that they're not completely familiar with. And so they might hesitate and wonder whether they're supposed to seat themselves, and now they're looking around for a host or a hostess, and it's a little bit more challenging just because of the fact that you're in a different cultural context. So this is culture, everything that allows us to kind of organize our thoughts in a way that is common to us. And using the Michigan Restaurant Association itself as an example to kind of quickly analyze the complexity of this term, perhaps the most broad cultural characteristic that defines the Michigan Restaurant Association and its members is that it's a U.S.-based organization. So it does reflect values of the American national culture in its operational capacity. So this could be everything from the technology that it uses, such as the platform that we're using today to facilitate this webinar, to the national holidays that it observes for its employees, and everything in between. If you kind of take that layer and peel it back, you can get a sense of how the Michigan regional culture impacts the Michigan Restaurant Association, how it operates, and how that might make it distinct in some ways from a very similar organization maybe on the east or the west coast of the country. And this is a function of our demographics here in the state, our landscape, our economy, all of those types of things that make us unique here in Michigan and impact the way that we operate. If you take a look at the industry that impacts this organization, the food service industry is absolutely huge and extremely impactful. It employs over 415,000 people and creates nearly $14 billion in annual sales. So there are aspects of this industry that influence the culture of the Michigan Restaurant Organization itself. Even things such as the trends of the industry. I was just speaking the other day with a professional in this industry who was explaining to me just how rapidly the trends go through, whether it's a certain dish or a certain style of food, or it's a certain style of service. There are a lot of different trends that are constantly going through this industry and impacting everyone, maybe more so than in other industries. So that's a cultural element of this industry that is impacting how you're looking at these concepts today as professionals working in this industry. The Michigan Restaurant Association itself is a business organization. It represents nearly 4,500 food service establishments throughout the state. That's huge, and if you think about it, this is made up of extremely different food service establishments. There are a lot of different individual cultures. If you think about it, there's going to be a much different culture within a Thai restaurant than there is going to be in a local franchise of a huge national chain. So there are a lot of factors that influence, and I won't expand on this point too much farther. But what I want to point out is that while culture has an extremely broad application, You'll hear me refer to words such as global culture or global diversity, which is a subset of a person's cultural identity that correlates to, as we said, the system of beliefs, values, customs, and behaviors, etc., that can be attributed to the country or world region that they come from and the influences that are primarily present within that region. And this could be anything from ethnic groups to languages, even religious elements, and so forth. So all of this to say that each one of us brings to the table in every interaction, every day when we go to work, we're wearing all of these cultural layers on top of each other. And there will never be two people, whether it's you and your kids, or you and your spouse, or you and your best friend, or you and a customer that came from the complete opposite side of the world. There will never be two people who have the exact same layers and the exact same cultural makeup. And so we have to realize that we each bring this set of predetermined and culturally influenced goals and objectives to our business interaction, and so do our customers. And that kind of sets the tone for where we're going from here. So how do we begin our process of how to actually manage these cultural layers and help them work to our advantage? Well, it starts with an awareness. A researcher by the name of Jules Davidoff once conducted an experiment where members of a tribe from Namibia who don't have a word for the color blue were asked to pick out the one blue square amongst 11 green squares on a screen. And in most cases, the participants of the study could not execute this task successfully. Interestingly enough, since this tribe has more words for various shades of green than we do in English, they had no trouble picking out one of the 12 green squares that was a different shade of green. And I put this image up on the board. If you're watching, I'd like to have you test it out and see if you can pick out the one green square out of these 12 that is a slightly different shade of green, which, as I said, was not a problem for this tribe that we're talking about. But I know that if you're anything like me, I personally completed this task unsuccessfully. So I'll give you a second to try to think about it and maybe look at your computer from a few different angles here. And then I'll point out that the one of a different shade is actually this one. Okay, so not sure whether or not you were able to figure that out successfully. Maybe you just gave it a good guess, but I know that's something that I was not able to accomplish. And so what I'm not going to get into is the sociolinguistic ramifications of this experiment, which get about as technical as what is occurring in our eyes when we look at the dress. If any of you are listening, you may have just cringed when I said that. The dress, which is a social media phenomenon about a dress which some people saw in white and gold and some people saw in blue and black. And there was a huge debate about it, which came down to what I understand to be some very technical elements about what happens in your eye when you look at things. I don't know all the details, but regardless of the details, and the same thing with this experiment with the squares, there are some extremely important considerations for cultural awareness that we can draw from this example. And I want to point out something else as well. Maybe you've seen this commercial, this Buick commercial, which says, yes, there are still people with blue hair who drive a Buick. This commercial has been described by Automotive News as the grandpa of auto brands is trying to be more like the fun uncle. Buick has long been identified with large, smooth-riding sedans that appeal to elderly buyers, but with the changing product mix, it's diversifying its marketing approach and trying to appeal to younger, more connected millennials. So, what is my point here? My point here is that although I would venture to say that aside from being colorblind and not being able to identify certain colors, most people here in the U.S. who would view this commercial or, something similar do have the capacity to see the color blue. And yet, up until hearing the story about the researcher that I just shared, most of us would probably assume that this is pretty universally recognized. But it's shocking to consider that people in other parts of the world could look at the same exact color, the same exact thing, and perceive it in a completely different way. And this is the epitome of cross-cultural awareness. As we interact more and more with people of drastically different cultural backgrounds and experiences, we have to actively avoid the assumption that we all perceive things in the same way. And this is magnified in our business efforts. So if you take a moment to consider that you're somebody from Namibia who happens to be here trying to buy a car, and you see this commercial and you don't see the color blue, and that's going to be a sticky point for you, and a hard thing to get past as a customer. And you're probably not going to be able to identify with the product enough to come to a sales agreement. And so there's a Chinese proverb that says, we see with what is behind our eyes through the prism of limited experience, not with our eyes. So again, this is all just to kind of point out the importance of awareness, and it doesn't come naturally. It takes an active effort to be able to start to gain the type of cross-cultural awareness that we're talking about here that's really going to improve your effectiveness in your everyday business settings. So other than just a general awareness, what do you need to start building your cross-cultural capabilities in a way that will enable you to better meet the expectations of, in this case, whom we're talking about is our global customers? Well, we need an awareness of our product and services. Erase that little circle there. So as businesses, we are constantly raising and identifying the different needs of our target markets. So this is an extremely crucial part of being a successful business. And this goal actually has been linked to parts of the consumer buying decision-making process. So as consumers, and we can kind of put ourselves in that role for a moment, the first thing that happens when, before we ever get to the sales counter anywhere, is that we recognize that we have a problem or we have a need. And we can identify this problem or this need with many different types. There are functional needs. So there are things like eating, for example, in which the food service industry fits into very well, where we have to meet the needs of our everyday occurrences. This could be anything from eating to buying a washing machine so that we can have clean clothes. Either way, there are functional needs that allow us to operate properly in our everyday environment. There are social needs that allow us to maybe fit in better to certain social contexts, gain certain social recognitions, anything from buying a really fancy car that maybe you don't need to get from point A to point B, to a new purse, things of that nature. And then there are the need for change and so on and so forth. So the point here is consumers attribute a level of importance to each of these needs, and the manner in which they meet this need, including every aspect of the purchasing process, including how much they're willing to pay for something and whether or not they're willing to return, depends on this level of importance. So what we have to understand is that cultural values influence this level of importance and that are associated with the needs of our clients. So what I'd like to do is just take food for a quick example. Hopefully something that we all can somewhat relate to, even me as somebody who is not necessarily working in the food service industry day in and day out. So we all know that food comes in various different shapes, sizes, forms, textures, prices, all of that. But at its core, food exists to meet a physiological need that humans have, which is to eat. And therefore, we can consider it to be universal in the sense that it's present in every place of the world to meet this need. And if we take it one step further, we can kind of consider it social value because it's a product that is universally shared and understood. And even with all of this, ability to kind of connect it to the rest of the world, which many people in many industries don't have that ability with their products and services, yet we still misunderstand the cultural dynamics that come into play when we think about the various levels of importance that consumers from different cultures associate with food. And ultimately, this does have an impact on its development and its sale. So there's an author named Amy Choi who writes, "Food feeds the soul. To the extent that we all have food, all eat food, and we all have souls, food is the single great unifier across cultures. But what feeds your soul? For me," says an interviewee, a first-generation Korean American, "comfort food is maybe a plate of white rice and fried spam. Such preferences are personally meaningful and also culturally meaningful. What you want to cook and eat is an accumulation, a function of your experiences, the people you've dated, what you've learned, where you've gone. There may be inbound elements from other cultures, but you'll always eat something that means something to you. And I'm sure that this is nothing new to professionals in this industry, but what we maybe don't spend enough time doing is thinking about what are these cultural values that people from different parts of the world associate. Here in the U.S., food is shaped by the natural wealth of our country, and since we have never faced an agricultural hardship per se that relates to, that kind of reaches the level of some agricultural hardships of other places of the world, we have had the luxury of not necessarily relying as much exclusively on rotating crops such as other populations like the Japanese, the Indians, or the French. Whereas in the Arab culture, food tends to be associated primarily with community, and so the picture on the left that you see here is actually a picture from this past year during Ramadan, earlier this summer actually, in Qatar, where they were celebrating the daily sahur, which is sort of like the early morning breakfast during Ramadan. And Ramadan, if you're unaware, is the 9th month of the Islamic calendar where fasting is observed from sunrise to sunset. And this meal features platters of, various platters, as you can see here, cheeses, fava beans, all of those types of things that are really shared by all who are sitting down. So this particular one, I believe, took place in a hotel or sort of a public gathering place, but there are obviously families who do the same thing, institutions who host private meals such as this, mosques, schools, other community organizations, and it's actually similar to the Chinese culture in this sense where one single person doesn't eat one single portion or plate, but is expected to kind of share things. So the picture on the right is one that I took from my travels in Italy, and there's an Italian food expert who says food in Italy is love first, then nutrition, then history, then pleasure. So you start to get the point of how we don't think about this every day, maybe even as professionals in this industry. And this is, I have talked to a number of professionals in this industry who have really brought this point home to me that your products and services, maybe more so than other industries, have cultural affiliations that we have to keep in mind. And our role as businesses is to think about these things and how our customers of different cultural backgrounds do associate different needs and levels of importance with our products and services. So what beyond this do we need to start to really pay attention to in laying the foundation for our cultural development process? Well, it requires an awareness of your industry. The graphs that you see on the screen are from the Multicultural Food Service and Hospitality Alliance State of Food Service Diversity Report last year in 2014. And you'll see in graph number 1 that this demonstrates the average percentage of ethnic and racial minorities in restaurant employees, the largest percentage of which is in hourly employees, which is over 50%, where ethnic and racial minorities represent over 50% of all hourly employees, followed by assistant managers in terms of percentage and so on. And the second graph that you see, one other thing that I want to point out about your industry and how it has kind of, become accustomed to our global diversity is that less than half of all companies that were involved in this study reported having a corporate diversity statement, and only about a third of all companies on average, which is represented in this bottom graph here, reported having a diversity strategy. So keeping in mind that there is a difference between the two. A statement is just that. It's a public statement issuing, your commitment to something, but a strategy is a set of institutional processes and systems that you're going to set in place in order to achieve this strategy. And this is outside of an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission strategy. A couple of other things. For restaurants that do have a statement, average restaurant turnover is almost 20% lower than those that don't have a statement. And companies with a specific corporate diversity strategy have 17% lower hourly turnover than those who don't. So these are some important things to kind of start to understand about the food service industry in general. And this reveals that there is a lot of diversity in the industry, whether we're talking about our internal teams or our customer bases. Yet only about a third of the companies on average have a distinct diversity strategy. And the costs of not having one of these are high when you consider the turnover and the associated expenses with turnover. So these are just some things to keep in mind as you're starting to understand a little bit more about your own industry and how you can cope with some of the globalization that we're experiencing even right here in Michigan. You need an awareness of your market, and this is arguably the most important piece of awareness that you can have, because it's becoming aware of who your customers are. And the graphs that you see on the screen right now are from a Nielsen report called the Multicultural Edge Rising Super Consumers, in which super consumers are we're talking about the growth of consumers that have a multicultural background, whether it's, being of various racial or ethnic populations. So the first graph that you see on the left is a U.S. Census Bureau population projection regarding estimated future growth in multicultural consumer populations. And you can see that the yellow portion is the Hispanic portion of this population, and that it's expected to grow by quite a significant amount and continue to grow, over the next couple of years and over the next couple of decades. The second graph that you see is American diversity by generation, and I know that I said that we were going to focus more on global culture today, which we are, but it's important to also take into consider that, as we said, culture can also mean your generational culture as well, and we know that our generations play an important role in defining who we are and how we act, especially in the food service industry. And as you can see here, each successive generation is becoming more multicultural, which is depicted in the red bar here, with the Gen Next population under age 9 already reaching the tipping point where the majority of the population is described by this study and defined by this study as multicultural. Furthermore, to become a little bit more engaged and in tune with what the trends are in our market, the first graph that we see here is that multicultural consumers are actually the fastest growing segment of the U.S. population. And I know this is a lot of statistics to throw out just for this little portion right here, but bear with me because some of these are extremely, extremely shocking statistics. So multicultural consumers are the fastest growing segment of the population, already over 120 million strong and increasing by 2.3 million per year, and then it goes on to say 191,932 per month, etc. And we see that Hispanics, African Americans, Asian Americans, and other multicultural segments already make up 38% of the U.S. population, with census projections showing that they will become a numeric majority by 2044. So that's the first graph. The second graph that we see is as the number of multicultural consumers continue to grow, so too will their purchasing power. Already here in the U.S., the multicultural buying power, as defined by this study, is growing at an exponential rate compared to the total U.S., increasing from, as you can see on here, the red block, $661 billion in 1990 to $3.4 trillion in 2014. This is more than double the growth of the total U.S. buying power. And the last one here that I want to share is something that I think it's just a staggering statistic. In 2014, it was reported that at $1.3 trillion, the 2014 Hispanic market in the U.S. is larger than the economy of all but 15 countries in the world. Just the Hispanic market here in the U.S. And their buying power is poised to hit $1.5 trillion this year. So enough with the statistics. I'll continue to hone in on statistics and facts and things that are a little bit more closer to home for us here in Michigan. But I just wanted to point that out because these are some huge opportunities for you, especially in the food service industry and others around the state operating in different industries as well. And it's up to us to really start to hone in on how we can take advantage of them. So this is where we start to take a focus on the different national and global cultures that are present here in Michigan. So what you see here is the percentage of the foreign-born population, which is just one angle to look at our population here in Michigan. In 2013, the foreign-born share was just over 616,000, or 6.2% of the population, which really doesn't seem like that much. But what I want to point out is this is actually more than the amount of people who live in Portland, Oregon. So if you let that statistic settle in a little bit, you can really start to see how just the foreign-born population in our state, so this doesn't even take into account international students, it doesn't take into account, you know, any of other populations who have national cultures that they identify with that are, you know, not based on the U.S. culture. So we can start to see kind of the percentages here. Mexico at 11.8% of the foreign-born population, followed by India, Canada, China, and lastly, actually, Lebanon. And so what I want to point out about this is that these people are here. They're our neighbors. They're members of our communities. They could be they could be, you know, people who are integrated in our communities in any type of way, but they're all potential customers. Here we start to get a feel for what this means in dollars and cents. So to take a couple of different angles, Michigan's over 29,000 foreign students contributed $927 million to the state's economy in the 2013-2014 academic year. Although international tourists only represent over 6.5% of traveler spending, it equated to $1.5 billion in 2014. And lastly, we have just the Latino and Asian population in our state, both foreign-born and native-born, wielded $21.6 billion in consumer purchasing power in Michigan in 2014. And so I say some of these just to point out that these dollars and cents are available to us if we kind of coach ourselves into how to access them and really start to enable our own selves to build relationships with these populations. And that's kind of what we're getting at today. So I have some other statistics. I won't go through them in too much depth because I want to make sure that we have time to get to everything. But I want to point out one of the most important things I think to note on here is that on average, Michigan is the 4th largest resettlement state in the U.S. for refugees, and given President Obama's recent announcement about you know, some of the refugee migration that's happening in the world, I think that this is important to consider as well as we consider our unique role here in Michigan to, you know, accommodate and to cater to some of these global populations. So how does this have to do with your industry? As I explained, traveler spending, it doesn't seem to be that big of a percentage when you're looking at international traveler spending, but this graph is from the Michigan 2014 Tourism Economic Impacts Survey or study, which represents that direct traveler spending equated to $4.8 billion in food and beverages in 2014. So keep in mind that this is your tourism spending. These are people who are coming from maybe other parts of the U.S. mostly, but there is still a huge population that's coming from different places in the world, and all of them, regardless, have various cultural backgrounds that we have to keep in mind. So in one of my recent articles that I wrote, I kind of touched on the fact that whether you're a statistical person or not, and whether these dollars and cents really speak to your heart or not, you can still start to see how you are being affected by some of these changes, even from kind of just noticing what's happening around your community. So even on a local scale, we see that businesses are changing. And I shared this first image on the left here of new restaurant reviews in the Grand Rapids area, where I just want to point out that 2 out of the 4 of them are international foods. And in one of my recent articles, I talked about a recent Google search that I did of simply, all I typed in was restaurants in Lansing, Michigan, and 60% of the results were actually international eateries. So I just kind of want to use that as an example of the fact that things are changing and adapting to our globalizing environment, and we don't want to be left behind in this trend. Even if you think about the expansion of international foods at your local grocery store, or the creation of places like Oriental Marts, or you know, I think this is a really interesting example. This Oriental Mart was here in East Lansing to kind of cater to some of the needs of the international students who are here and their unique food and beverage needs. And right next door, this pool and karaoke club opened up shortly thereafter, which again was to cater to some of the social needs of the same populations. And so this is an interesting phenomenon because these businesses are kind of just starting to sprout up and really having enough success and enough impact to continue and multiply. And so I also like to bring up the story of a Lansing area realtor who's been in the business, and this is kind of jumping into a different industry here, but he's been in the business for 45 years and has kind of, particularly done well adapting to different cultural dynamics. He worked with Korean populations in buying commercial and residential property, and he got referrals when Chinese students started gradually investing in the community. And the first property that he sold was 4 years ago, and ever since then, he has sold 25 to 30 properties to Chinese customers, resulting in $3 to $5 million in sales annually. So he has since expanded his staff members and hired Chinese counterparts and so on and so forth. And in his words, their presence is subtly and quietly changing the community. So now that we've kind of taken a look at what this means, what this change looks like for us from the top down and from the bottom up, hopefully we've started to correlate some of our personal identification, some of our own goals and environmental considerations into this trend. And so I'd like to just kind of take a minute to step back and consider, what does this mean for us as professionals just operating in this global context, especially in this industry? Does it mean that we have to start changing our products? I mean, you're probably thinking all the examples I've been bringing up about international foods and people changing the way that they do business, and all of that is something that is maybe starting to scare you a little bit. So I'd like to just kind of play this video so that we can have some fun with our different considerations here. Yep. Hopefully it'll load back up in a second here. Okay, so maybe you have a response to that. Feel free to chat it to me if you do. Otherwise, I just want to point out that does this mean that as populations from all of the countries that they mentioned start to, filter into our lives here in Michigan, that we have to start to change our products and change the way that we do business in order to accommodate all of these different customs? No. But as we referred to earlier when we talked about the different cultural associations that are inherent in food products themselves, you have to understand that your customers are going to be approaching your food product or any from completely different perspectives. They're going to be attempting to use them to meet completely different needs and associate various levels of importance with them. So it's your job, regardless of the product, to help them make that connection and maybe make new connections if you're, if you're really into this. So this can have a really positive impact on your customers' experiences and ultimately your bottom line, not by changing your products, but by just adapting the way that you help your customers associate to these products. I wrote in my most recent article, and I'm not even sure if the magazine has been released yet, I kind of described a conversation that I had with somebody who works at a Michigan-based Mediterranean restaurant, and I asked her what her biggest challenge is when it comes to working in an international restaurant or working across cultures, essentially. And she described a lack of personal interest and connection by her staff with the food products themselves because they were, foreign recipes, as the biggest challenge that her team faces. So it wasn't language barriers, it wasn't, learning how to make the food or serve the food or anything related to really customer service, as much as it was just getting her staff to identify and connect with the food, because ultimately, as we know, this allows them to sell it and it allows them to convince people to come back next time and try something different and all of that good stuff, which ultimately translates into dollars and cents for your business. And I thought this was extremely important insight, not just because of the international food, but even, this has an application for American consumers and actually even in a contemporary American food setting. When we're serving globalizing audiences, we have the same responsibility, just in the form of the inverse. So, we may have a better ability to connect with the food if we're more familiar with it and we grew up eating it and we kind of, can pronounce the words that are included in it. But can we take the opposite and understand where our customers are coming from in order to help them relate? And these are some of the strategies we're going to be looking into, also kind of digging into these during our in-person session at the October trade show. So what does this mean? Does it mean that you have to change your team? Again, I referred to a lot of various statistics about the restaurant industry and noted that there's a lot of diversity, but maybe not a whole lot that is, that is done to really, really embrace that diversity. Again, the answer is no. You're never going to be able to make your team match the diversity of your customer base or the diversity of your food products, such as the people in this picture. And creating a diverse staff just for the sake of having a diverse looking staff, just for the sake of the demographics, won't help at all either. What we have to kind of start to learn to do is to leverage the diverse perspectives of the people that we already work with, and all of the cultural layers that they're covered in. And that's, again, what we're going to be digging into a little bit more when we go into October. But it's just kind of food for thought, no pun intended, for now. Lastly, does it mean that you should have paid more attention in your foreign language class? Well, if we took a Spanish language class, we probably all could have paid a little bit more attention, but we don't advocate to set something like this, which I'm going to show you in this quick video, as the bar for effective customer service across cultures. Okay, so I won't play the whole thing, but you're probably wondering why I said that we don't want you to set this as your bar for effective customer service across cultures, because this actually seems like a very admirable customer service strategy, and it is. But the fact is, our world is made up of 7 billion people speaking 7,000 languages. So you're never going to be able to hire somebody who speaks them all. You're never going to be able to learn them all. And most of all, you're never going to be able to predict when you'll need to communicate, even in English, with somebody of a completely different cultural background. So these skills, there are skills beyond language barriers that can help you to improve your customer service across cultures. And, in the food service industry, we are all much more susceptible to some of these skills than people in other industries because we've learned how to read people to initiate effective customer service. And that's really what I want to focus on throughout these sessions. And so this graph just kind of represents that in a chart format, which demonstrates that in a survey by the Economist Intelligence Unit, the majority of people said that the greatest misunderstandings in cross-border communication were in fact attributed to cultural differences or norms, behaviors that are associated with culture rather than language. So 2 more really quick points here, and then I'll kind of open it up to see if anybody has any questions. What does all this kind of boil down to? If I introduced a lot of considerations about how people from different cultures associate with different food products differently, but I'm telling you not to change your product, and I'm saying that, it's really important to leverage the diversity of your team internally in whatever operation that you're working in, but I'm telling you not to change your team. And, I'm saying that it's important for us to understand various customer service preferences for service across cultures, but I'm telling you not to, set the bar too high and necessarily change too much about your customer service strategy. What does it all mean? Well, what it means is that you don't have to change anything unless you want to, because the bottom line of all of this is you won't be effective operating across cultures. And I have talked to so many people in so many different industries, including the food service industry, that have reiterated this to me based on their experiences. And obviously this is something that I sort of preach day in and day out. You won't be effective working across cultures unless you actually have a desire personally to do so. You have to be able to connect your own personal interests with your cultural development process, and that's the foundation for everything that we do. And it's so crucial that I've kind of spent, the majority of this webinar leading up to this point. So I want to bring it home with a couple of scenarios, 2 scenarios, and just so that you know, these scenarios have been crafted based on the real experiences of people working in your industry right here in Michigan serving global guests. And so I've kind of used them to craft a little bit of a case study here just in the next minute or so. So scenario 1, you have a group of Japanese professionals that are here visiting for business. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and show my little infographic for a Japanese person or little graphic here, and it's incorporating the Japanese flags, which you may recognize from some emojis. So you have a group of Japanese professionals that are here for business. They ask you to recommend a dish. You're not sure what they might like, so you're a little bit hesitant. So maybe instead you opt to tell them about the mouth-watering chopped barbecue beef brisket that was just added to your menu, right? And that's fine. They seem to be somewhat interested, and then they ask if you have a certain kind of tea, so you make the extra effort to go all the way back and double check, and you double check with the bar, although you did get a little sidetracked in the process because you were swamped, but it's to expected during peak mealtime hours. And you serve the guests, and everything seems to be going well. They seem to enjoy the food because they're eating, focusing a lot on their meal, and you're trying to do your best, your absolute best, to implement your most upbeat, relational customer service strategy possible. So you can check on them during their meal to ask how things are tasting. You know, their response is pretty short, but you assume that it's because they're enjoying the meal so much, and then they leave, and and maybe you get a decent tip and things are well. If you're thinking about this approach, it probably sounds okay. It probably sounds like it went pretty well. You did your best. You didn't really know a whole lot about the Japanese culture. They seemed to enjoy it. They gave you a little bit of a tip because they're aware of that custom here in the U.S. And that strategy. Will they come back? Probably, and they will, and they have, based on the experiences of the people that I've talked to who have kind of crafted this little bit of a simulation for me. Here's approach number 2. When your Japanese guests ask you to recommend them a dish, you don't know that much about the Japanese culture, and you've surely never been to Japan, but based on some inquiries that you've had about previous menu items and some observations that you've made about previous patrons, you've been able to find out that you do know one thing. You know that one of the staples of Japanese cuisine is soba noodles, which are long, thin buckwheat noodles. So you think to yourself, you know what, I think I could recommend them something that we have on the menu that incorporates this, which is, just for the sake of this example, a soy and ginger salmon with soba noodles, okay? So you've spent some time kind of learning and about not necessarily memorizing, but observing different expectations for service across different cultural groups as they've come into your restaurant, and it's evident in their body language, their verbal speech. So you've come to understand some of the expectations, such as what's depicted in this graph. I'm focusing more on the Japan column. This is a study by a University of Nevada student entitled Cultural Impact on Customer Satisfaction and Service Quality Evaluation. Obviously, this is geared more towards hotels, but the service implications are the same when you're looking at different hospitality industries as well. So you recognize that the ability to solve problems promptly, you've picked up on the fact that this seems to be something that is somehow inherent in their expectations. So when they ask you if you have a certain type of tea, if you haven't already made a mental note of it, you make a dedicated effort to be as efficient as possible and let everybody who tries to get your attention, everybody who tries to get in your way as you go back to check on that particular type of tea, know that you will be right with them as professionally as possible, but you know that it's important that you get an answer back to that table as soon as you possibly can. Furthermore, you pick up on the fact that the people you're serving are not talking a whole lot while they're eating. And while this could be interpreted as just some really good food, which it probably is, maybe you actually decide to read this body language and not make a routine interruption to see how the food is tasting. There was a president of University Arts and Cultural Department who was talking about traditional dietary cultures of the Japanese, who noted that compared with other people of the world, I think Japanese think particularly deeply about eating. In other words, this thought is like an identity for Japanese people. Take parties at American homes, for example. Drinks and conversation, not food, constitute an important factor there. Eating in Japan and for Japanese communities is a means of communication, not a facilitator of communication, but a means of communication in the home and communities. So as I said, these two different kind of scenarios that we've just walked through were crafted from professionals in this industry who have been on both sides of the coin. And these differences don't seem all that significant. And like I said, if you operated by scenario 1, your guests would probably come back. They would have probably had a fine customer service, customer experience. But when the professionals that I've spoken with were able to actively respond to the cultural cues that I've brought up and create a personal connection, like even their slight little bit of knowledge about the soba noodles, this has not only resulted in higher tips, but the guaranteed return of these particular patrons, maybe even as regulars, as well as a commitment to bring their friends, which ultimately ends up being, improving the bottom line of your business. So I just would like to, I would just kind of like to take a moment to point out that there are Improving your cultural sensitivity is not going to be an overnight change. It's not going to be an extremely drastic change where you're going to come to work the next day and everybody's going to think, that you're a superhero and your tips are going to improve by 250%. But over time, if you really are dedicated to this process for all the reasons that we've just explained, then you will start to see a little bit of a difference, and you'll start to see it in your customer loyalty, in just the overall experience that you can tell that your customers are having, and in your tips and in your bottom line, and that's what we're going for here. So last thing here, going back to the survey that we took at the beginning, if you still have your answers, I'd like you to kind of take a quick inventory, and if you answered mostly A's on the surveys, you probably have an intrinsic interest, more of an intrinsic interest in, which is kind of the extent to which you demonstrate a natural interest or enjoyment in your work or in multicultural experiences. In this case, we're kind of combining the two. And maybe you don't place such a high value on the external benefits you receive because of the personal satisfaction. Whereas if you answered mostly C's, you probably have more of an extrinsic interest, which is the extent to which you see tangible benefits from multicultural interactions and experiences and your workplace environment. In this case, again, combining the two, and you don't necessarily derive as much personal enjoyment, which is okay. The point is, you have to understand where you fit into this spectrum, and there are other types of motivation that exist, and there are resources that we have and tools that we have to be able to help you measure this if that's something that you're interested in for yourself and your team. But ultimately, starting to get a feel for how do I motivate myself to lay the foundation for this cultural development process, so that I can see some of the results that we're talking about here. There's some strategies that are up here on the screen. I'm happy to go through them in more depth with anybody who's interested, and we will talk about them more in the in-person experience in October at the trade show. But I just kind of wanted to point that out so that you can at least start to get a feel for where you personally are at in your motivation for operating appropriately across cultures. This case study, I put it in here. I wasn't sure if we'd have time for it or not, but we will go through this when we talk in October as well. So I hope all of you will join us for our session there. And lastly, I just kind of wanted to point this out because I think it brings home the point of everything that I've been talking about pretty well. When I say that things are changing in our environment and they're globalizing, and I'm encouraging all of us to get on the bandwagon, and all of these things are happening without us really even realizing it, I really mean it. And this picture is actually a picture of my dinner from last night. And trust me, this was after this whole webinar was already crafted. And we've been talking about the soba noodles and using that as an example. So I'm thinking about the webinar, and I go home and I start to make dinner, and I didn't even realize until I was halfway through my meal that I was actually cooking soba stir-fry noodles. So things are changing with or without us realizing it, and I hope that these concepts have helped you to establish a good foundation for essentially your motivation for improving your cross-cultural skills so that you can positively impact the experiences of your customers, your reputation, and ultimately your bottom line in an increasingly global community. And just for the record, I only set off the smoke alarm once during this process of cooking the soba noodles, so in my opinion, that was a success. I'm not you guys, okay? So join us on October 13th in Novi. We're going to continue building on some of the strategies that we introduced today. And I really appreciate your participation. I know it takes a lot to take time out of your day, but I hope that this is a commitment that we can really be a resource for you in your cross-cultural development process. So thank you. And please let me know if you have any questions. I can stay on the chat, or we can you can talk verbally if you'd like. Okay, and I've been informed that there's another meeting that will be taking place, so I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we're looking forward to meeting all of you in person soon.